Welcome to Skillful Living and Artful Life. We are here today with a very special guest. I mean, they're all special, but our guest today has been a criminal defense lawyer for quite some time. He actually is a luminary. He's considered a luminary amongst his peers, which is a nice thing to know. Alrighty, he's been a defense lawyer in the New York City area and also on counsel in capital cases. He is served as a deputy clerk for Chief Judge Constance Baker Motley, and also a member of the faculty at Santa Clara Death Penalty College since 2008, as well as faculty on National College for Capital Voir Dire since 2014. He received in 2019 the Honorable Louis Cohen's Award for Professional Excellence, and in 2023 he received the Gideon's Promise Champion of the Community Award. So without further ado, I present to you Richard Jasper.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you for agreeing to do this. It came up to us very quickly, but we weren't messing about.
No, you weren't.
All right. So we are here in our great city of New York City, and you grew up actually in one of the boroughs in the North Bronx. And what was that like coming up for you? Because it's probably very different from when you grew up.
Yeah, I was born in I was born in Harlem, but my family moved to the Bronx probably in the mid to late 50s, and so a section of the Bronx is called the North Bronx, the northern regions of the Bronx, Williamsbridge, Wakefield section. And it was very, very different than it was today. It was much more quiet. There were parks, a lot of things to do. I spent a lot of time outside playing sports, football. So I had that advantage of having a little bit more space than other areas of the Bronx, and it was a lot of fun, actually.
Oh, good. Have you been back to visit your old stomping grounds?
Not recently. I've been living in Manhattan for like the last 20 years or so, but I spent quite a bit of time up in the Bronx, as we say,
Mm-hmm.
the BX, and just had a real good group of friends from elementary school to junior high school on to high school, public schools in every case.
Right. So would you say that having this close knit of friends and also being in sports kind of kept you safer?
Yeah, being in sports definitely kept me safer. I played a lot of touch football in the streets. You know, we had the lampposts, and like a lot of people in that time and in that space. When the lights went out, that was when you knew you had to come. When the lights came on, that was when you knew you had to come in. So
Right.
as it got dark, the street lights would then come on, and that was everybody's cue.
Right.
You know, to go home. And then in high school, I played high school football, which was in a much more organized fashion. Exposed me to coaches. The coaches did that as a second job. So they were either a physical ed coach or a history teacher or an English teacher or a math teacher. Teachers who loved football, so they were real student athletes, teacher athletes, you might say.
Right.
So there was that mix. It was a great time.
That's good. Were any of those teachers a mentor to you that helped you figure out what you were going to do next in your life after high school?
Oh yeah, especially the head coach was a fellow named Cy Kalman. When he really cared about the students, he always stressed that we were athlete students, that if we didn't keep our grades up, we wouldn't be able to play. And so actually, when I started playing when I got on the high school football team, my grades actually got better because I was worried about, not being able to play. So practicing with the other, teammates, it was a very diverse high school in the neighborhood. So we had these amazing mixtures of people who were from the North Bronx, working class, lower income, people also from Manhattan, from Harlem, because at that point, students weren't restricted to go to a certain school in a certain zone, so they were able to travel. And some people traveled from the South Bronx, and some people traveled from Manhattan. So it was a very, very diverse mixture of students, which I think has really helped me throughout life in being able to deal with people of different backgrounds.
Yeah, it's definitely helpful. And so, did one of your coaches kind of encourage you to apply for Wesleyan University?
Wesleyan, yeah, he did. So it was probably the end of my junior year, and to show you how detailed the coaches were, they had all of the juniors would come in and speak to all of the coaches. I remember they were all behind a table, and then we would go into one of the rooms, and they would ask us what our future plans were. Do you plan to go into college, and what do you want to do afterwards? And I said, yeah, I want to go to college. I didn't have anything in specific in mind, and I thought I would stay local, and this one, the head coach said, well, I think you should apply to Wesleyan University. I'd never heard of it, didn't know where it was, and he said, I think this is, I remember him specifically saying, this is your time, meaning the school was looking to be diverse, and we didn't use the term diverse in the sense that we use it today, but basically he meant they're looking for black students of color. I found came to find out that it was considered to be a small elite New England school, and there had been so much turmoil in the '60s with riots in the cities, and just a lot of unrest and a lot of recognition, especially I think after President Johnson's commission on civil disorders, that there were essentially two Americas, and America and one had advantages as one didn't have advantages, and so many of these schools were reaching out to make their student bodies look more like America.
And you benefited from that.
I definitely benefited from that. Actually, the coach, and again, this speaks to the type of person that he was, took a day off, jammed a bunch of us into his car, I think about 6 of us, and drove up to Middletown, Connecticut for an on-campus interview.
Wow.
I mean, who does that? I mean, just one of those key points in the arc of your life that was a major turning point to expose me to a way of thinking and different people and tremendous faculty at that school. It was a great experience.
So who was your favorite professor?
My favorite professor.
And why?
Yeah, my favorite professor was a Russian historian professor. I've always been fascinated by history, and looking back at it in retrospect, it's because history, you learn stories about people, about times, about cultures, and so history took me back. And he was a person, his name was Philip Pomper. He would make you feel as though you were actually transported to a historical event. And so I remember him, his specialty was Russia and the Russian Revolution. And since so much social change was going at the time, it was something. It was a course that this was a course that I was just naturally gravitated to, and the name of it actually was a very complicated, pretentious name, but it was the history of the Russian revolutionary intelligentsia. So really what it was in plain English, it was a story about the key thinkers and activists in the movement for freedom at that time in Russia, because Russia had Russian serfs almost around the same time, throughout the same period that we had American slavery. Of course, there's practically no historical parallel to American slavery, but so there was a great shift over the course of time. And so what I learned from him and his tremendous storytelling is how to look at a movement and progressive thought over the course of time to see how it changes. And so we studied the different periods of thinking up until the Russian Revolution. So it was something that I was absolutely fascinated by.
So different from the culture that you grew up in.
Yeah. And it was just it was a small town, overlooking the Connecticut River, and I was able to get away from home and be on my own for the first time. And I had academic scholarships and met just an incredible range of students at that time. And the late '60s, early '70s was pretty exciting time.
And so when you went into Wesleyan, it was all male. And then at some point while you were there was a shift where they started to allow women in.
Yes, it was. My class was the last all-male class, and then the years afterwards it became co-ed. So you really kind of had a sense of what the all-male prep school type of experience was like, even though there were many of us from public school, black students from that ran the range of middle class, upper middle class, guys from North Philly, guys from the Hill District in Pittsburgh, challenged inner city neighborhoods, but had accomplished academic success, and so were specifically chosen. It was an extremely diverse within the black students, and of course those were very activist times because we had all grown up exposed to the many changes in the 60s.
Yeah, well, because that was 1969. So those were considered the hot years.
They were considered the hot, active years. Vietnam was a huge issue. It was impossible to be, agnostic about the Vietnam War, meaning you didn't have, there was nobody who didn't have a strong feeling about it, because if you were male and you were 18, you had to register for the draft, and you were susceptible to being drafted if you weren't in college and have what was called then a 2S college deferment. So by the late 60s, more and more men were being drafted to fight in Vietnam, and so it became very much a political hot issue as to why we were there and what we were fighting for, because it was just a very different type of war from World War II, which our parents had been exposed to.
And did you feel that while you were at Wesleyan, because you were probably exposed, especially in Connecticut, there was a lot going on, I know in New Haven at this time, did you feel that on top of what was going on in Vietnam and civil unrest within our own country, not just because of the war, did you feel that while you were on campus, or was it like a bubble for you students?
It was a little bit of both, quite frankly. We definitely were tuned into all of the political unrest and the political activity. I remember there was a trial going on in New Haven of Bobby Seale and I think three other Black Panthers. You know, and also America in general, the campuses had very strong thoughts about the war and about the bombings and about the nature of the war and the way the war was being fought. So in many respects, there was really a unity of agreement amongst young draft-age men, be it you white or Black, who were questioning what we were doing in Vietnam. Of course, there were many people who were going to Vietnam because the government, drafted them and said, this is a just and fair war, and we now understand, that a lot of those young men suffered greatly too, especially when they came back because it was such a controversial war.
Did you attend any rallies?
I did attend a rally. I attended rallies on campus. I went to the big rally in New Haven. And, the other part of your question was that there was this political activism, but then you also had a sense of being in a bubble, being on this beautiful New England campus, rolling campus, trees, just like a postcard. So it was, I realized how special it was and what a privilege it was to be there, but only in the ensuing years, as I've gotten older, have I realized to what extent it changed my life and changed the life of so many of my classmates.
Yeah, because even though it was New England, I mean, there were probably issues with segregation in other parts outside of the campus that you had to contend with.
Yeah,
perhaps.
I mean, outside, we were concerned about how, city residents were being treated. So there were local kind of issues that many of us were involved with. We had the Afro-American Society. So we were debating different issues and strategies the same way that was going on in the real world outside of our protective bubble.
That's good.
So the system had reacted to the national strikes across the nation, and as evidenced in New Haven, there was a very strong, military and police forceful putting down of some of these demonstrations, even though many of them were peaceful. And so the presidential elections upcoming focused on law and order, quote unquote law and order, that the society was coming apart. What are we going to do about these young children? And it was really just a sense that the system had to crack down on the national protests. At the same time, we also had the civil rights movement. We had the beginnings of the women's movement. So there was a lot going on in the nation for young students, for their parents and grandparents, where they were really facing a different kind of America.
All righty. So that by the time that you graduated in 1973, where were your thoughts? What were you leaning towards? Or did you feel like you needed to go on a quest, like a vision quest for yourself, so to speak?
Yeah, I felt like I had to go on a personal quest, because at that time I just wasn't ready to enter the workforce. And my mind, putting on a suit and tie was not like college graduates today, which is what they seek. At that point, I felt like I didn't want to compromise with the views that I had held. I'm not sure that it was exactly well thought through, But that's what it was like at that particular time. You know, it was I had a very anti-establishment viewpoint, and the war actually war in Vietnam was winding down. We were really entering the first big recession of the 1970s, and so I didn't want to continue my formal education. I wanted to kind of take a step back and assess, where I was at and who I was.
Yeah, I like the saying by Tolkien, "Not all who wander are lost."
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
So did you delve into, since you were always an avid reader, right? You were always you love to learn. Were there any authors or artists or people there were so many people that were up and coming at that time that were doing incredible work.
I kind of went back, I still kept my love of history, so I was reading a lot of the Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes, especially. I love this series that he had, Just Be Simple. Jesse Be Simple is a whole tremendous short stories that he created around all of the issues that he had dealt with, issues regarding segregation, racial injustice, but in a very practical means. And so I started to also look into yoga and meditation following college. Some people went right on to law school. Some people went right on to medical school, to graduate school. I had toyed with the idea of going on to graduate school in history, but at that time, one of the things that we used to constantly, it was almost like a mantra, a constant saying, you want to be relevant. We always, stay relevant, be relevant. And at that time, I didn't really fully appreciate the relevance of being a sound, accurate, ethical historian. So I didn't want to be live in academia. And so it took me a while to figure out what I wanted to do.
Sure. I remember when you and I had our second conversation, you mentioned John Coltrane, who was a very spiritually sound man, in my opinion, and his art just proves it. But there was a book that you had mentioned that you felt that it had informed you quite a bit.
Yeah,
during those years.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a biography of John Coltrane, the legendary tenor saxophone player, and at Wesleyan we had a lot of tremendous jazz musicians. We had Miles Davis, we had Rahsaan Roland Kirk, we had Gary Bartz. We had Mahavishnu Orchestra, so Pharoah Sanders. I mean, all of this during the 4-year period. So it was great. But I was rummaging in a bookstore, and I saw this book called Chasing the Train, and so it was a biography of John Coltrane, and in it, Sonny Rollins, also the great tenor saxophone player, had recommended to John Coltrane the autobiography of a yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. And so I said, well, listen, if Sonny Rollins can recommend this book to John Coltrane, maybe it's something that I would take a look at. And I had seen, as they say, the AY, the autobiography of a yogi, in a bookstore on the East Side, and started to read it and became really kind of fascinated with the whole concept of yoga and meditation and kind of quieting the mind and focusing the mind on particular issues.
So would you say that part of your journey is what gave you clarity into saying, okay, I'm going to go into law? Was it part of it? And I'm sure there were other factors as well. But
yeah, it was a big part of it, in that I said to myself, well, I have this education and I'm trying to figure out what I want to do, but I have to do something. I wanted to make a meaningful contribution to society. That was something that was always a theme throughout the 60s and all of the people like Martin Luther King and, Malcolm X and all of the leaders, Medgar Evers, people who had been, assassinated in trying to make a more just world. So I figured that yoga was another tool that I could put in the toolbox of activism. I didn't see it as being passive. I didn't see it as being, irrelevant. I thought it was a way to kind of get myself centered, and because injustice was still going on, inequality was still going on, issues like that, and so I started to realize that the best way that I could most immediately impact it, I think, was by being a lawyer.